So good to see many familiar faces, some new faces. And with that said, let's get started. Just to let you know, this is part of a set of new things that we're trying. As many of us, we are adapting to this new way of working. So I'm saying hello to you from my living room. Apologies for any mess you may see behind me. And so we're all on this together. We're trying new things, and that is why we may reach out to some of you after the event for some feedback and see if there's value in continuing to do this thing, or we should try different formats. So today, what we are going to talk about is 5 big trends to keep an eye on into 2021, trends in the space of reward and recognition. Many of these things were already high up on the agenda before the pandemic, but it's been interesting to see how the pandemic has either accelerated some of these trends or reshaped some of these trends. But overall, thinking back of conversations with our clients and many of you, the work that we're doing and what we're seeing out there, these are 5 trends that we feel are particularly important to highlight, and hopefully will give you food for thought to shape your agendas and your plans these years and in the years to come. We will be looking at the 5 particular trends, including well-being, job evaluation, performance management, performance-related pay, and recognition. Before we start looking at these trends, just for those who are not very familiar with what we do, we are a reward and employee experience consultancy based in London. We were founded in the year 2000 by Alan, who you may see on screen. We work with clients across the spectrum of reward and recognition in everything from reward strategy to pay structures, the evaluation, benchmarking, and so on. And we're also looking at the area of employee experience, where we are developing a lot of new services. So we've developed an employee value proposition diagnostic. We've also actually worked with clients in designing their employee value proposition. Performance management is part of this practice, and it's something that we are developing continuously. So now that we and you know a little bit more about us, let's start with the first of these trends, which is well-being. So if we are able to think back at pre-pandemic times, distant as they may seem, well-being was already high up on the agenda. There was a lot of activity. In fact, if you went to certain events, conferences, you probably see 90% of the program or stands featuring some form of well-being service. So it was already high up on the agenda. There's a lot happening on this space. And with the pandemic, it was pretty much top of the agenda. I think that really showed how organizations felt that duty of care towards employees, they took it to a new level, and employees recognized and appreciated that. So the conversation around well-being is about some of the interventions that you see here on the screen, but the bigger question is, how do we take this forward? How do we build on this momentum that has been created around well-being? And how do we tweak or fine-tune our efforts to provide the support that people need? And very importantly, is not only providing the support that people need, but also the support that people need but may not ask for. So how do we make sure that they're supporting people and they don't wait until they arrive at a critical point where they really need to ask for support? So that is the core of our thinking and the ideas for how to take well-being forward. So from that point of view, there are 4 main areas that we believe organizations should be paying attention to. The first one has to do with senior leadership involvement. We see it as critical for senior leadership not only to role model, to actively engage with well-being, but to also become champions of well-being. Obviously, because of COVID, it was unavoidable for well-being to be seen as a priority. But there is a question mark over what may happen after COVID. Will well-being be slowly dropping down the list of priorities? So I think COVID gives us a great platform to make sure that well-being stays top on the agenda, and having senior leadership on board will be critical to make sure that well-being is not just seen as a nice to have going forward as and when things start returning to normal, but that it is and it stays a business priority for organizations. We need to make sure that well-being doesn't fall by the wayside. The second point to pay attention to is to start switching our approach and our thinking from being reactive to being proactive. And this speaks a lot to this point that we were making earlier around the support that people need, but they may not be asking for. So as part of being proactive, an essential activity would be to keep our eyes and ears open, to listen attentively to what employees are telling us and what they may not be telling us, or what they may be showing, and make sure that we have the mechanisms in place to capture those needs, to understand where employees may be struggling, where they may need support, and not wait until we arrive at breaking point before we start triggering interventions. So looking at how we can approach things proactively rather than reactively will be very important for the recognition agenda going forward. The third point, and we put the spotlight on financial well-being, not to underestimate or undermine all the other areas of well-being, but because we think here is where there is a bigger opportunity to have a bigger impact with employees, because on other areas we've seen a lot of activity already. I think financial well-being has been the area that is probably lagging behind a little bit and deserves a bit more attention. First, because financial matters are one of the biggest causes of stress for employees. During and after COVID, it's likely that some households have taken a hit on income because of furlough, redundancies, or other circumstances. We don't know what type of pressures employees may be feeling. It may not be related to their employment status directly, but within the household, there may be other pressures that may be creating additional anxiety. In addition, some organizations will come out of the pandemic in a cash-strapped scenario. We've already seen in the public sector announcement of pay freezes, and we're likely to see them for a while. So financial well-being stresses the importance, because delivering higher levels of pay will only be an option for a few organizations. So having a wider conversation around financial well-being, being proactive in terms of education, and having mechanisms to support those situations that trigger anxiety is very important. So for instance, having facilities in place for people to access emergency funds, especially those with lower incomes who are particularly vulnerable to big expenditure all of a sudden if the boiler breaks or if you need to fix your car. And that's the kind of thing that can throw people into financial distress. Even higher up, we've heard stories of people who, even though they have a higher level of earnings, they're still almost operating within their means. So having those types of facilities, not only the education, but also the emergency mechanisms to support them will be important, will help relieve some of that anxiety, and may even relieve pressure on base pay. The final point that we want to make is that of using a holistic approach. So again, we're putting the spotlight on financial well-being, but well-being only works well if you're looking at all areas, because focusing on only one area may overlook issues in others, and they tend to have a knock-on effect on each other. So looking at financial well-being, emotional, mental, social, is very important. So with well-being, a holistic approach to this matter is definitely the way to go. Overall, I must say I've been encouraged by the interventions, the activity, and the priority that has been given to well-being. There's been some great stories out there. We've seen examples of one of our clients, actually, directors hand-delivered Christmas hampers to their employees, and that landed very, very well. In another organization, the CEO sent letters to employees' children, acknowledging and apologizing for the impact this has had on their households, and gave them an Amazon voucher. And we understand these things may land well in some organizations, may not land well in others, but it's just to showcase some examples of what's happening. For us at QCG, actually being able to have our team quiz on Thursdays, it's been very good to relieve some tension, to park work for a while, and just to claim back some of that time that you have when you're in the office, and share and have some banter, have a good laugh. We also did a socially distanced picnic last year, which was also great fun, but also showed that we will not be entering any Frisbee competitions anytime soon. But on the whole, I think at the end of the day, we were all glad to spend time together, because it reminded us of the value of being together as a team. So definitely things to think about and to build on from the pandemic. The next point that we are going to look at is job evaluation. So again, pre-pandemic, we had observed an increasing activity on job evaluation, a lot of it coming out of gender pay gap reporting requirements, greater scrutiny and visibility of the equality agenda. So organizations felt greater urgency to put their house in order. It was no longer just a HR or reward issue. It became a business issue and a business risk. So that was already underway. Now, what happened during the pandemic was that the conversation also turned to the contribution of roles. Are we accurately measuring the contribution of roles? What mechanisms do we have to do that fairly? And most importantly these days, how can we do that in a transparent way and in a way that's relevant to the business? I highlight those two attributes because those are often mentioned as the main challenges to the more traditional analytical points-based methodologies that we have in many organizations, that they tend to be seen as opaque and distant from the business. And this has come into the whole question of how do we measure contribution in a better way? How can we have greater transparency, greater relevance to the business, without losing the rigor that a good job evaluation system should bring to support defensible decisions, to defend and prevent equal pay claims. Off the back of that conversation, what we've seen is a space where contribution-based models are finding their way forward and are increasingly being part of those conversations. And in a way, they are a solution that works very well because they are much closer to the business. In our work with clients with those models, you're bringing someone into a meeting who's never seen the system, and within an hour, they're fully clear on how it works, the key factors. To be a bit more difficult to cheat, you have less risk of a grade drift than you do with other methodologies. Cost effective, easier to train people. In the background, it can still have links of grading structures to the more standardized industry structures, a Willis Towers Watson, a Korn Ferry Hay, and it can provide the rigor and defensibility that you want out of your evaluation decisions without some of the issues that you face with the more conventional, traditional methodologies that have been predominant up until now. So if you have dual evaluation on the table, this is definitely a good alternative to explore, one that we've seen has been having positive results. This is a bit weird because normally we were at a live event is when I would take a pause, I would ask people for questions, and that will give me a second to have a sip of water. So I'm going to do this now. And apologies for the awkward silence. And I'm really crossing my fingers that my drink doesn't go down the wrong pipe and I have an episode of coughing in front of you and it's being recorded. It will make for a great blooper, but no, I haven't fallen for that. So performance management is the third topic on the agenda. And it's a very interesting topic and very topical on its own. Right before the pandemic, there again was already a lot of noise around performance management. There was a lot of hype around the removal of performance ratings, and that was drawing a lot of attention. Interestingly, we saw enough of that to see some of the impact and how many of the organizations that did away with performance ratings actually returned to some form of rating, showing that the ratings in and of themselves are not the problem. There are some more fundamental things to look at in performance management systems. There's also been a lot of talk around how to make performance management systems more fluid. How can we have better conversations? How can we in general make performance management work better for the employee and the employer? On top of that, during COVID, there was an added element of complexity around how can we actually effectively do performance management if large portions of our workforce are working remotely. People won't be on top of them, they will be able to see each other every day. And that could well continue even if things start getting back to normal. So all of this brings into question the degree to which the traditional approach to performance management is still fit for purpose. Personally, I don't believe is just something that you should dismiss, but it's definitely worth a look and see what is good for your organization and how do you want to approach performance management to employees. When we look at some of the issues with the traditional approach, we see that is really based on a lot of carrot and sticks to drive motivation. Places a bit too much focus on outputs rather than outcomes, and it had become a bit too transactional. It always surprises us, even though it comes up often when we go to organizations, and when people talk about performance management, they talk about the form, and it's all about the form and the process and not what you want to get out of it. And I've also found it fascinating how when you say someone is being performance managed, it means that they're in trouble. It means that they're underperforming, which just shows this paradox and the wrong perspective that we're taking to performance management. So with that, we've built on that context and that situation and have developed some thinking around a new way to approach performance management, and we're using the term performance development. I saw this in some obscure article a few years ago, but I think it captures very well the essence of a new way of looking at performance management. It's a new approach that is not about looking back and slapping people around the wrist or give them a tap on the shoulder if they did bad or if they did well. It's about looking forward. It's about enabling employees to do their best work. It's not so much about specific outputs. It's about what are the outcomes that we as a team and us as an organization want to achieve, and what it is that you need to be doing to get us there, and how do you need to behave to support those outcomes. As part of that conversation as well, it's a very important element, which is, what do you need from us to do your best work? So the employee drives the conversation, but the employee, as part of that ownership, also is in a position to say, I need help here, I need help here. So that also supports better development targeted to what the employee needs, rather than assumptions of what the employee may need, which is a very different conversation. This type of approach supports that fluid conversation, which is about how are you doing, how are you progressing the key activities that you need to do to achieve outcomes. Do we need to switch focus? Do we need to change your priorities to a new set of activities? And having that as a fluid, ongoing conversation throughout the year, rather than just a conversation that you have at mid-year and end of year. That also helps free up performance management from the pressure of ratings and the links to reward. And actually, you can focus more on performance management and have separate mechanisms to determine reward outcomes linked to performance, if that's what you want to do. So what you have here on this slide is some of the key features of this approach. We've also written articles that you can access on our website. But for the timing, those are the key messages around performance management. And I'm going to move to the next topic, which is performance-related pay. And one of the many quotes by Winston Churchill that I really like is that you should never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think this crisis, if we can call it that, followed the pandemic, it's really given us an opportunity to think or rethink what we do with aspects of reward that are linked to performance, and really test some underlying assumptions that are increasingly being proven incorrect in our experience and our clients' experience, starting with base pay and the links of multi-pay increases to performance outcomes. And what we found is that very few organizations actually make it work well. The actual impact on employees is so small, especially with small pay budgets. But the downside in terms of the wrong behaviors that it can drive, the inconsistencies, and overall the negative impact it has on the integrity of the performance management approach, just really brings into question whether it's even worth it to have that direct link between performance outcomes and best pay increases. Incentives, bonuses are also another area that is worth looking at. And back on the day when we could have live in-person events, I remember we had a conversation about this, and we asked attendees to who can raise their hand to say their incentives are working well. And very few, if any, actually did. This is not to say that there's no place for incentives. There is, but there are a few assumptions, again, that need to be challenged. Some things that need to be clear about. The first one is really understanding how much control do employees really have over the variables, the metrics that determine pay award outcomes with incentives. Do they really have, can they really influence that? Because if not, then it's a time to refocus and reposition these incentives. Often we find that incentives are there to make pay more competitive, to reduce the risk of guaranteed pay, and those are all valid reasons to have them in place. But again, we are just mis-selling them by telling employees that your bonus will be related to your performance, and then it gets modeled in the process. So let's have more open conversations about the purpose of incentives around the design. And as part of this conversation, there are opportunities to also look at the design. If we are going to be more outcomes rather than output focused, then maybe have more behavioral or even developmental aspects as part of bonus or incentive metrics. And we've already seen more behavioral measures coming into incentive metrics at all levels of organizations. And also, does this mean maybe a greater shift towards team-based rewards? There's no right answer. It will depend on many factors for each organization, but there's definitely thinking points that you should take back and reflect on when you are looking at incentives. To finish this section, I'll leave you with something that I found and really struck me in a recent article from the Harvard Business Review about incentives, about whether or not financial targets drive performance. And it said that organizations must carefully consider what they truly value and wish to reward under the current circumstances, rather than simply carrying over the old criteria from last year's evaluation cycle. So again, let's not let this crisis go to waste, and let's make sure that we take the time to reflect on whether or not the links to performance, between performance and rewarding organizations, are working well, are fit for purpose, and support the goals that we want to achieve. Finally, we have recognition. And recognition has been around for a while. It's not new. The conversation and the greater emphasis on recognition predates the pandemic by a long time. What's interesting, in our view, is that despite the emphasis, the visibility, despite the proven links between recognition, engagement, and business performance, there are still organizations that are not getting it right. And that, again, in the pandemic has made a little bit more challenging by remote working and changes to working, ways of working and structures and locations. So there are some interesting questions to explore in terms of how to make recognition work or how to make it work better. One of the things that we found is that currently a lot of the focus on recognition is on the mechanisms to deliver recognition rather than on what really motivates employees. When I go into discussion forums of HR reward professionals, and you see questions about recognition, the questions tend to be mainly around which platform are you using, what technology, which provider, and there's very little about how do you think about your strategy? How do you determine what the right provider is for you? So again, you implement a beautiful platform where people can access discounts, can give each other virtual high fives, stars, rainbows, balloons, anything under the sky, and they're still not working. And we find that organization often failing is in understanding what is it that truly motivates their employees. And it's not about asking the question, what motivates you? It's about having a different conversation. It's about really getting to understand what has made them feel special in the past. What has really worked? When did they feel motivated? When did they feel recognized? And it is in those conversations that you find the real golden nuggets that can help you shape a relevant and an impactful recognition plan. But it all starts with this conversation, and you can then build on that by having employees involved in the design of recognition schemes, by having greater flexibility into your plans. The different things motivates many of us. Yes, you could find common patterns, but the more flexibility you have, the greater your ability will be to do something that matters to people and that really motivates them. And most importantly of all, to keep that human touch alive. And I mean, we've all been part of it. I've been part of it. When one of my colleagues actually sends me a message with a very specific feedback about something that they thought I did well, that really means something to me. Then if they throw a bottle of wine on the side or something like that, well, even better. But it's that context, the human touch, the ability to really say, provide detail around these things that brings recognition to a different level. The problem with platforms is that people just rely on the platform. They say, okay, I press this button, I put a like there, or I send someone a £10 voucher, and that's it. I've done recognition. But recognition and those gestures without context, without the human touch, don't have much value. The value is on that aspect, and it's an all example. It's always relevant. That's the value of handwritten notes. Like that someone took the time to think about what you did, put it down on paper and give it to you. That means a lot. So let's always keep in mind, how do we keep the human touch? How do we make sure that recognition delivers context? This is not to say, again, that there's no place for platforms or technology, because they can do great things. But those platforms, those technologies should not be the starting point of the conversation. They should be the end point. Once you found out what motivates employees, you understand what it is that you want to do, then look at the technology, look at the platform and find what can help me do this better. Sometimes you may not even need it. Sometimes, and some of the more impactful things are very low cost. So let's keep that on the table. I think you've probably heard enough of me by now, and I'm hoping the accent didn't get in the way of you understanding some of the key ideas. That's another reason why it may be good to have a recording. You can probably watch it in slow motion or with subtitles if it helps. What we'll do now is we will move to any questions that you may have. Again, we will circulate these slides. We will make the recording available. You can read about some of these ideas and some of our thoughts that go a bit deeply into some of these aspects. When you go to our website, on our insights section, there's a lot of articles about these topics that can also help you trigger some ideas. But in terms of what we discussed today, if you have questions, please type them on the chat room, or comments or an experience that you want to share. Okay, and Alan has got the ball rolling. So the question is a contribution-based approach crossing a line of evaluating the person and not the role? And I think this is one of the challenges that you always come across with job evaluation. And I'd like to actually look at these questions through a different lens. Because it's still about evaluating the role, but it's about a different type of evaluation. It's not so much looking at what the individual needs to bring to the role as an input in terms of education, experience, and sometimes potentially discriminatory factors. It's about what the role is there to do. How does it contribute? And what's very interesting about these models is that you can define different levels of contribution that apply across the organization. And then you can use more specific language for different functions that show, okay, what contribution looks at different levels for that specific function. And you can provide a lot more clarity that is around the role, but it's about the role, not in terms of the letter of the job description. It's about what it is there to do, the outcomes, again, and contribution to the organization. We have a question from Paljit. We have ongoing issues about progression within grade. However, we cannot do this without putting some performance indicator to show that it is a fair process. Ideas. But yet a few things to respond to that, to consider. The first point is that you can make it work, and we've worked with organizations that have a good performance management system that is clear, consistently applied, and properly operated, and that can help underpin that progression within the grade. There are other vehicles for progression as well. We've worked with clients looking at competency-based progression. You may know about this. Positioning within the range. Those are also factors that can come into progression. These contribution models can play very well to that as well. But this doesn't mean you should not have performance. The key message there is you need to make sure that performance management is working well. in order for that to work effectively. And you need to make sure that the links to reward do not get in the way of the right performance management. I have a question or comment from Emmer. Sometimes the problem is that you have to do a role-based evaluation when it is the individual contribution in the role and their value to the organization that needs financial recognition. Yes, and actually from that comment, I think there's a word that really stands out for me, which is recognition. And recognition can provide a very valuable tool to, well, recognize and acknowledge the contribution of individuals. But when looking at it through the lens of recognition, you'll give yourselves a lot more options in terms of the timing, the amounts of awards that you can deliver, because recognition doesn't just have to be vouchered. You can deliver significant amounts of cash-based awards using recognition principles that can prove even more effective than traditional incentives, and that's something worth exploring. We'll look now at Peter being so into the Hay methodology and a little out of touch with contribution-made models for JE. Can you provide a little more detail about how they operate in practice and the kind of factors and decision-making that happens within such a model? Absolutely, Peter, and we'll be happy to share with you and anyone else who's interested some more literature on how they work. But to put it in very simple terms, the starting point for contribution is for you to determine in your organization in different areas what it is that drives key business outcomes. What are the key aspects of contribution that lead to those outcomes? Then you can align your grades to those statements, those descriptors of contribution at different levels. This is an iterative process whereby you start with an initial draft of descriptors, you test them with the business, with different areas. And as you do that, the language evolves, it becomes much closer to the business, it becomes much more relatable. And then what you have at the end of this is your grading structure with descriptors. Basically, when you are going to evaluate using this process, what you do is look at the key aspects of what a role is there to do, compare them to the descriptors and find the more appropriate grade. And that is a very, very high level description, but it is very simple. And for me, the best proof of how intuitive this model has been to have managers walk into conversations and within an hour, them being perfectly able not only to understand the system, but they're also capable of explaining it to their teams and to understand how evaluation works. So could I ask the team if you could write down who would like to have more information about contribution models so we can circulate that. Hopefully that helped Peter, and as our Peter Fairchild mentions there, we can always have a follow-up conversation. But we'll be happy to share these materials in case this provide an additional thought.
Juan, I had a backup question, which I think I'm going to ask in light of everyone, a number of people wanting information on the contribution-based model. It feels to me like in our consulting in the past sort of 12 to 18 months, we've had a lot more people that want more information about moving away from an analytical model more towards a contribution-based model. Why do you think that is particularly, why has that particularly been the trend in the past year or two? What's sort of been the tipping point for that, do you think?
Well, we've seen a number of reasons. One that is very often quoted is that the systems are very opaque. It's a bit of a cliche, but we do use the term black box used very often to describe how job evaluation works. On the one hand, you have a process and a method that is very detached from the business that people can't really see. But also on the other hand, those who do know the system get very good at gaming that system. And depending on how granular your grading structure is, you can be in a situation where just little changes to job descriptions can get you enough points to get you to the next level. And it creates this whole pound for points culture. And then what you have is people queuing around the corner, coming in with evaluations with requests to reevaluate roles. That's one of the issues. The other issue that we found is that when you look at the detail of this methodologies, the language tends to be, or can be, very academic or abstract. It's very technical. It's made for reward specialists. It's not made for the business, which again fails to make it relatable and easy to understand for the business. Also, depending on the methodology that you use, it may be geared to a particular type of job or may ignore very junior roles or very senior roles. So there are some gray spots in some of the methodologies too. And the fact that because it's highly technical, highly specialized, the methodology becomes the private domain of just a handful of experts rather than a business tool that people can understand. So those are some of the main reasons and some of the main concerns that people have. But people are failing to look at what else is out there. This was taken as these models are the only option that we have for job evaluation. So been a very interesting change in mentality when we've had these conversations around contribution. So I think everyone or most people are interested, so we'll probably just send this to everyone. There's some more information around contribution models, and we'll be more than happy to have a conversation. Peter, that question, are there any proprietary? They are by nature bespoke, and that's the beauty of them, because they are made for your business with language that you use in your business and descriptors that reflect work and contribution in your business, your organization. So by definition, they are bespoke. You could potentially have some standardized models that can help you as a starting point. But again, because they're designed to apply or be applicable across organizations, the language may be too detached from the organization. So I would say the more bespoke they are, the better they'll work. And it doesn't take a lot of time to get them right. We've gone through projects when we start from scratch and have all jobs evaluated within a period of 2 to 3 months. And just being conscious and sensitive of time, we're already overrun by 1 minute. So I think we're going to leave it at that. If there are any more questions, please contact us, anyone in the team, or respond to Hattie, who you would have received the invitation to this event. We will circulate the slides, the materials about contribution models. And if you don't mind, it will be really, really helpful if you just answer to a couple of questions. We'll also send with some feedback to help to understand if this worked or if we may be doing better with other formats. Again, thank you all very much for attending, for your attention and your patience. And I look forward to speaking to you again in some form and hopefully in a way that you can talk back as well. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.